I'm not a big art person. Actually, those art history majors, I'm a little sus about, right? But they do. So it was just amazing because we think of Van Gogh and Claude Monet as two really big influences in the art field, but they couldn't have lived two different lives, right? They actually both died in France. Ended up their burial places. Van Gogh died at 37 and Monet died at 86. And beyond all how early Van Gogh died, it was crazy. His life was just full of turbulence. And a lot of that turbulence came from a lot of mental issues, a lot of fluctuations. There's also a lot of substance abuse. And many of what Van Gogh's paintings and all the things that he made, Starry Night, all these amazing paintings, he actually did not experience any of that, the fame of that. He was not really recognized until literally after he died. Actually, he's buried right next to his brother Theo. And it was Theo's wife who actually blew up Van Gogh, right? And like really, they knew it was such, he was an amazing talent. He was only really painting seriously for about like 7 years, which is crazy. He was just like really prolific. A lot of people speculate that he was like either polar or schizophrenic, but we really don't know, right? We know that there were issues there. He didn't really experience this, like I said, this fame. His burial place is really it was actually a really amazing sight to see. At the last 2 weeks, he stayed at a doctor's retreat, right? And he rented this room and he would paint to kind of pay for room and board along with his brother, but helping him with that. It was crazy. Supposedly he had a fight with his brother and then he came back and he ended up shooting himself. It took 2 days to die, actually, and he shot himself in the stomach. That's a weird way to kill yourself, right? But he even painted all these amazing things toward the end of his life, and that really reflected the turbulence, the Black Hawks and all of these other examples reflecting on that. And he wasn't known during when he was alive, but he went guns blazing. But his legacy is of all these paintings. In contrast, Monet died at the ripe age at 86. He also died in the French countryside in Gifnay, a beautiful place, right, where he drew water lilies. He had all of this like real estate and land. We visited his amazing, essentially, he built the landscape because he really was a disruptor, right, of Impressionism, because it used to be people did serious paintings, right? Painting of the Bible, painting of wars, portraits, and painting landscapes was not considered serious. But he was a lifelong painter, and he was doing that serious Renaissance style before that. He was like classically trained. Then he realized, man, this is like, it costs a lot of money, and you have to do only the set amount of serious stuff, serious bullshit, right? So he really like, oh, what about the landscapes and doing that? So he actually built his subjects. He planted stuff, built gardens, and painted water lilies and all these beautiful landscapes, which we know Monet for. And his life was relatively stable. Well, the only hard part was he was disrupting a whole kind of industry and making that. But he did receive a lot of fame and world recognized to the point where even people, American artists, would go over there and rent out areas in the town of Gifnay and would literally be influenced by him, and we visited the American place where they housed those artists in this small town because he was well known, and he died a peaceful death with all his family in these gravestones. But his life was more stable, right? You saw this stability trajectory. What really connects both of them beyond the art, they knew that this art would go beyond themselves and then transcending their, I guess, mortal bodies. It's kind of amazing to see just like the medium in which they came at it, right? Van Gogh came from that YOLO perspective and pure emotions, and Monet was more of like, okay, serenity, and this is what I'm painting, landscapes and all that stuff. But they both knew that their work would transcend themselves, right? And this is where we get at this concept of generativity, right? In terms of what is left for the next generation beyond themselves, right? So this generative part of it. It was hard for to see it with Van Gogh because he didn't really have disciples. He didn't have people who he trained or anybody, but he knew that his work was going to transcend himself, especially he produced actually a lot of work in those 7 years. And that was just like based out of pure emotions and like feelings. But just seeing like their resting places in the French countryside, it kind of brings home like these people at two different paths and two famous people, but they still end up in the ground with a gravestone, So it's like, it's great that we remember them and everything, but it's like, it kind of reminded me like we all end up in this similar, same place. So two of the major people and their resting places in a different time. But this was one of the saddest things when I saw Joann Fabric. All good things come to an end. So today, it's the last day at Joann Fabric's. So let's see what's up. I feel like Joann's is this place of creative expression. You could get so many things here. You could develop, I used to get popsicle sticks, those styrofoam ball things I remember getting there, and everything under the sun to create something, right? You create your own art, you create your own pieces of stuff. It was like a modern creative space where you could just buy shit, like that you could just think of. And I don't know, it was just really sad walking around and just seeing all the empty shelves. And well, much of what happened, the demise of Joe, is because of private equity, right? And private equity, essentially, Joann's was a public company that ended up getting bought and made private. And they weren't in debt at really before they were bought, and then they got bought, and then private equity essentially just ruined it and this place, and they didn't innovate fast enough. People are buying stuff from Amazon, the one-day shipping stuff, or fabric somewhere else. It just became more and more areas where you can buy stuff, and it was just changing. The way people were purchasing was changing. But private equity, it was not really focused on the business. They're mostly focused on profit. So they ended up liquidating many. Well, that's what they did. They went filed for bankruptcy and liquidated all of their assets. So creativity is really about creating something unique / novel, right? Something that is like unique plus useful. So we see with Monet and Van Gogh, they had these different styles of impressionism, right? But that was like really unique, generally unique for its time because of most people painted these serious things of the Bible, this war, all these serious things from the Renaissance era. This is like a big shift in impressionism. And then useful, right? And this is the hard part. What is unique and useful is really subjective. So when sometimes you see art, you're like, what the heck? People are just drawing circles and, oh, wow, that's an art piece. But this represents the geometric shapes of the earth, the universe, all about the interpretation of it all. That's where I saw what Joann's was. This is like the ability to express your creativity, but thus capitalism, I guess, wins again, or loses again in terms of private equity. I don't know, just seeing Joann's was really, really sad in terms of like, oh man, all this stuff is gone. My wife and a couple of my friends, they were like, this is really sad because they used to go there with their grandma to make things like clothes for their Beanie Babies or sew things with with their mother and make things with their fabrics that they have. So it wasn't just a closing of a store. It was like a closing of an institution of like creative expression for them. This is definitely a unique lesson that I typically do. I'm usually higher energy, Celsius and everything, but part of all of this, right? Kind of lessons and thinking about death for my whole life about like, what do I want by the end of my life, right? And part of that is to creative, right? What do I want to leave uniquely behind in the world that is useful, and I think part of that is that transcendence. How do we do things, right? Do make projects and influence with people that really help transcend death. I know many people, we think about like Van Gogh and Monet with their art and everything and how that makes them feel and transcend. And then with Joann's, it's like the death of an institution because it took away a tool of this expression. The end gets you thinking, just like that social emotional selectivity. It's like, what is important to you and important to your life? And that what gets you like, I want to make, for me, I want to make these lasting creative things, particularly lessons in psychology that transcend. A lot of all of this is like what happened to me when I was 10, almost drowning in a pool. That kind of changed my trajectory of how I thought. But then also it's just getting me to realize, like seeing others fail and die and or they're living their life and end up in a certain place. It's just, that's why I'm a developmental psychologist, really understanding these pathways. We all have these different pathways, such as Van Gogh and Monet, right? One's turbulence and YOLO, other is like really calm and stable trajectories. But all of that, making these creative outlets that transcend the self is like really connects to like, why are we living and how does that gonna make a lasting impression on the world? Thanks for joining me on this journey of the end, right? Walking through it from this creative lens perspective. So I will see you next time. Peace. Hot.